All right. Well, welcome everybody, all of you here and all of you at home. Welcome to our meeting tonight. I'm Erwin Cooperberg. I'm with the Londonderry Conservation Commission, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's program and our speaker. I need to refer to my notes because his background is so extensive. Roger Allbee was the Vermont Secretary of Agriculture in the past. He was appointed to the position by Governor Douglas in 2007, but in addition, he's served in many other roles in agriculture in the U.S., with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and in many other capacities. Actually, if I read the whole list, we'll be here all night. So we're very fortunate to have Roger with us tonight, and he's going to speak to us about the role of agriculture and how agriculture has affected the Vermont landscape and how the landscape of Vermont has affected agriculture here. And it's a 260-year story, isn't it? So without further ado, here is Roger Allbee.
Thank you. Thank you. Whoop. My wife tells me I'm not good at computers, so.
Yeah. All you gotta do is talk.
Talk, okay.
But just center yourself and make sure you're in the script.
Well, thank you. I've been fortunate in life. I'm at that age where I can look back and say where I grew up and the values I had in growing up in a very small Vermont community called Brookline, which is just over the hill from Putney between Newfane, really instilled in me a lot of the values that I took with me professionally and personally throughout my life. And it was then a very small farming community with some second homes. My family had been there for generations on my father's side. And one of the things that was very dear to me in looking back was the sense of community and how people helped each other, how they accepted people no matter what their background was, no matter what their religion, or no matter what their lifestyle, and they always helped each other in what they did. When I was in Montpelier doing that ag secretary job, in the evening sometimes I would spend time in the safe. It used to be the old National Life building. And in the safe, there were a lot of the old yearbooks of agriculture going back to the 1800s, all the way up to today. And I would read through them because I believed that if you didn't understand the past, you couldn't appreciate the future and some of the changes taking place. So I spent a lot of time reading about the past and also some of the things that were happening that indicated the future. Many of you, somebody here said they were on the historical commission for Londonderry, right? And I think as I read it, your town was incorporated 1770, originally as Kent,
Right.
and then from a New York grant, I believe, at the time. The town that my ancestor settled in 1766 was a grant from Governor Wentworth of New Hampshire, who was also, and you know of the conflict that was existing between New York and Vermont over those grants at that time. And the role of the Allen brothers, who historically were after their own gain and seeking land. And at the time, one of the Allens, Ira Allen, went to England and wrote to the Duke of Portland then, I think in 1779, how inviting Vermont was, or the state that would become Vermont, because of its soil and ability to grow grains and barley and oats and wheat and other things, and that it was a place for people to migrate to from southern New England. And of course, they did migrate here after the French and Indian War, and the population increased from 50,000 to 150,000 in a short period of time because of those people coming here, even my ancestors. And of course, the land really was Native American land. A great deal of artifacts exist. If you ever have the opportunity to go down to the Wyndham Historical Society, and they have a lot of artifacts of Native Americans and that have been dug up on the riverbeds and other places, down in the retreat meadows and some of those places, going back thousands of years, because the property really was Native American land that all of our ancestors took over. In many ways, and that happened later on too. One of the things that settled Vermont in terms of, I think it was when Vermont became a state in 1791, there was an agreement between New York and Vermont, both on the boundaries, as well as that Vermont would make a payment of $30,000 in gold coins to the state of New York to settle that conflict. And if you have a time, there's a book called The Vermont Difference that was written by the Vermont Historical Society and Woodstock Foundation just a few years ago that has a lot of history of Vermont by many authors. And one of the authors in there talks about this, and the $30,000 in gold coins was actually held in Rutland, Vermont at the time, and when it was taken to New York, the wagon carrying it tipped over in the middle of the night, and the person having the wagon had to go to some local neighbor and go back and find the coins, put them back on, and take them to New York in the middle of the night. So interesting history in that regard. But one of the things that in my review of ag history is that Vermont is not a farming state anymore. It's certainly known for its specialty food and some of the products now coming from the land, and we know what they are: the cheeses, the wines, the distilleries, maple and other things. But we're not a farming state anymore as such. And the reason for that is several things that have taken place. In 1830, several thousand farms, of course, in the state. Most people were farmers or somehow connected to the land, and they were all self-sufficient in some way. In 1900, there were 33,000 farms, and 86% of them were dairy, and most had a sugar operation. My family's farm, growing up, had a small dairy. My father and uncle had a sawmill as well, and they sugared in the spring. So you had that taking place. In 1930, 75% of farms had one product, and it said that 3% were self-sufficient. Today we have 6,500 farms in the state. Now you have to, according to census, you have to put that in perspective, because according to the census, anyone that sells over $1,000 is considered a farmer. And that's a pretty loose definition. And if you look more closely,
recording in progress.
If you look more closely at it, one half sell less than $10,000 in products. So you have a lot of very small operations that do it on less than a full-time basis. And 3% are responsible for 2/3 of the ag sales, according to the census in the state. So, and 58% is dairy ag sales. So you've had a lot of consolidation taking place, which I will get into later. Of course, the first commercial product was potash. Does everyone know about potash being produced on a farm? That was the very first commercial product that, because they came up here and they had to cut down the woods, the trees to make the land able to grow products. And potash actually was made by hardwood, burning the hardwood and in a trough or something, and then taking the water that came out of the burning it and baking it into a big kettle. Some of you may have seen these potash kettles that had existed in the past. And England actually passed a law in the 1850s that encouraged the production of potash in the colonies. And that was basically the first commercial product. They got $5 for 100 pounds and it was a form of currency, a form of wealth. And actually sometimes it was exchanged for food and other things, including alcohol and beverages. Grog, they called it at that time. And that trade took place for several years, and eventually the market disappeared for a lot of reasons. Of course, New England, Vermont, in the Champlain Valley was the breadbasket of New England for a long time, especially in the 1830s. And until diseases and bugs and competition, as the production moved westward, we lost that market for a period of time. Of course, then came merino sheep, and we actually did have more sheep than we had people, by quite an extent. And that came about for several reasons. Oh, there's a little bit of conflict in the history, if you dig into it, as to who was responsible for bringing in the merino sheep. In the history of Vermont, we talk about William Jarvis, who was consul general to Spain and Portugal at the time, appointed to that position, and eventually resided in Wethersfield, Vermont, because he had an uncle in Claremont, New Hampshire, and he brought over about 4,000 merino sheep from Spain, Portugal at the time, as Napoleon had invaded, and they wanted to make sure that the flocks were not seized by him at that time. But it actually wasn't Jarvis that was the first one to do it. A guy named Colonel Humphreys from Connecticut, a place called Humphreyville, Connecticut, later called Seymour, Connecticut, that brought the first merinos over to the country. And some of them ended up in Westminster, Vermont. And the industry took off. Jarvis was sort of like the Ben and Jerry's of the sheep industry at the time. He went around promoting them vigorously. And after the War of 1812, of course, he was instrumental in creating tariffs, or he had good contacts in D.C., so they put tariffs on the importation of wool into the United States, and the price of wool jumped up considerably. And Jarvis was responsible for that. But that tariff collapsed in about 1840 due to pretty much opposition from the southern part of this country with cotton. I was very concerned about how that impacted the cotton market. And the tariff was eliminated, and about half the sheep flock were destroyed in a short period of time. But it continued. The Civil War, of course, had a great deal of impact on that because of the need for wool for the uniforms of the soldiers. And after the Civil War, it was really the breeding stock that kept the industry going. There was a farm up in Addison County called the Hammond Farm that really was quite well known for the breeding stock. And in Vermont, participated in a trade show in Europe and won awards for the best fleece and the best prize fleece in the world for their sheep. And of course, the value of the breeding stock multiplied immensely. If you look at history books, some of the breeding stock sold for $50,000 for a ram back in that period of time. If you put that in today's value, that's a lot of money in today's value. And that continued for some time, but it was almost impossible to keep that industry going in Vermont because as the railroads came in and other things, in the land increased as production, as people settled the west, they could raise sheep out there for 50 to 75 cents a head, and it cost us $1.50 to $2 a head here. So the industry really didn't become very competitive. But our sheep were shipped all over the world, breeding stock, Australia, New Zealand, and other parts of the world, and became very much the foundation for the merino sheep industry in other parts of the world. It's kind of interesting that there was some opposition to what the sheep industry was doing to the environment at the time. We had a congressman in Vermont named George Perkins Marsh, related to the Billings family down in Woodstock, who made a presentation to the Rutland Ag Society in 1847 about how the land was being destroyed. And he was very concerned because sheep grazed very close to the ground, and how that was potentially destroying the land and the water and erosion of the soil. And of course, his speech became the basis for the book he wrote, Man and Nature, which was the first book about the conservation movement in the United States. He resigned shortly thereafter, although he was took a position at some time too in the water quality position with the state, looking at the impact too. But anyhow, as the sheep industry sort of declined because of the lack of ability to be competitive, there was a movement then into butter, making butter and using milk cows for that purpose. In the beginning, of course, the kind of milk cows we had were not, and they used to spell milk M-I-L-C-H back then. The kind of milk cows they had back then were not really of any great quality, and that's why you had people like the Billings farms and others, Billings, of course, going to the Isle of Jersey and bringing some good breeding stock in, others doing the same thing, and that's why you had more attention going on to the production of milk on these farms. Before 1850, much of the butter production that was being taken place was pretty much made in the home by the early settlers. And reading some of these old books, I'm going to quote something, and please don't take any exception to what I say, but it said the best butter was made in the following way in the home. You had to have a good churn, good water, good salt, good cream, and a good woman. And without those qualities, you couldn't have good butter. But quickly, butter really was made commercially, and at one time, St. Albans, after 1850, became sort of the butter capital of Vermont and certain parts of the world. We were shipping butter around everywhere, and even Londonderry. I have some data here for Londonderry. I think you at that time were, let's see, what did I have? 50,000 pounds of butter and 10,000 pounds of cheese in 1850, just in the town of Londonderry, was taking place. But the whole industry sprang up around the whole butter industry at that time. Montgomery, Vermont had 3 sawmills making butter boxes, if you've ever seen those butter boxes. Thousands of them. The Bellas Falls Machinery Company was making churns and things for producing butter. So the whole industry sprang up around the butter trade at that time. And the first butter train actually went from St. Albans to Boston in 1850. And they had to stop on the way and put ice, of course, in the train to keep the butter from melting. And of course, some of you may be old enough to remember the margarine wars that took place because of the concern about margarine having an impact on the butter market. And Vermont was very much a part of that. And the butter laws that some of them were trying to pass Vermont passed a law like with other states at the time that said butter had to be colored pink to be sold. I mean, margarine had to be colored pink to be sold. And you say, well, that's interesting. And the case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And they said, no, you can't do that because of the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, which says that one state cannot interfere in the trade with another state unless it's a human health issue. And that certainly wasn't considered a human health issue. So they said margarine had to be colored the original color that was made, which was white. And margarine started out, of course, when Napoleon III challenged scientists in France to develop a product for the population and for the military that could be used. And it quickly, in 1869, it quickly spread to the United States, and we had several plants over here making margarine. And several of the states, of course, became very concerned, and some of the laws were put into place which in Wisconsin existed until a couple of years ago, or a few years ago. And Vermont had the same law that said if you went into a rooming house or a place that served food and they didn't serve you butter, you could go to the local constable and the place would be fined and you would get 1/2 of the fine as an individual. So I used to, I have a son-in-law and daughter in Wisconsin, and I said, you probably shouldn't do that if you go, but those were the kind of laws that existed because of the industry reacting to the whole margarine thing, and there was even a margarine tax that took place. You may have remembered, if you're old enough, that if you went to the store years ago and you bought margarine, there would be a colored pack with it that you would have to squeeze with the white stuff you bought to make the margarine yellow in color. Some of you remember that? Doing it? And that was part of the way to create what they thought would be some ways to stifle the margarine trade. Then, of course, the fluid milk market took off because the cities reached out to the states nearby for fluid milk, and at that time we had a lot of what I call local creameries and cheese operations. In fact, in 1900 we had in the state about 186 creameries and 66 cheese factories in the state. One of the oldest, of course, being the Crowley Cheese Factory, just up in near Scotney, Vermont, one of the oldest operating. And even Calvin Coolidge's father, with the Coolidge Cheese Factory, goes way back as well. But we had a lot of local creameries, and I think in Londonderry you had one called the Mountain Lake Creamery, somewhere around here, in South Londonderry. At least the book said that, somewhere. Of course, in Newfane, and the Newfane Creamery as well, and a lot of local ones at the time. Well, what changed things? Well, and by the way, I want to say, before the temperance movement and in the 1850s, you had more distilleries in the state, according to history, than you had towns. I think you had about 173,000 gallons of apple brandy being made as well. So what's come back? History sort of repeats itself in some ways going forward. Of course, what changed things? Of course, transportation had a big impact on things. In the beginning, of course, it was state-authorized turnpikes across the state. Route 30 was a turnpike at one time, all the way from Brattleboro to Bennington, and other turnpikes as well. They eventually became state highways. The canal systems that existed. The first canal in the United States was in Bells Falls in 1792. and the navigable river all the way from above Bellows Falls down to Hartford, Connecticut. And they used rafts that were 72 feet long by 11.5 feet wide, and they draft 3 feet of water. And they can carry 30 tons, and it took them about 25 days to get through all the locks to Hartford, Connecticut. And they did it, and a lot of trade took place at that time. And then, of course, the Erie Canal, and it began in 1870, all the way from the Hudson River to the Great Lakes. And DeWitt Clinton, when he proposed it, of course, Thomas Jefferson said that he must have something wrong in his mind to propose something like that, a little bit out of his thinking. And it became one of the wonders of the world at the time. And New York became the largest port in the United States. And of course, the migration to the west took place as a result of that. Once the canal was completed, you could ship from the Midwest wheat, a ton of wheat for about $10 a ton, where before it cost $100 a ton, and you could do it in 1/3 of the time, according to history. So it had a big impact on the movement of trade across the United States at the time. As I said, it was called one of the wonders of the world. And of course, the Champlain Canal as well in 1823, which connected to the Erie Canal and the canal system. And some people said that really opened Vermont to the world. After that, I think Burlington became one of the major lumber markets in the United States. And then you had a lot of canal boats working their way with apples and other products all the way through the system. And at one time there was a proposal, of course, to connect the Connecticut River with Lake Champlain and the canals on the other side. They figured out they really couldn't go over the mountains very well to do that, so it never was done. But anyhow, the canal system, and then the railroads really changed the whole makeup of trade in the United States. There are three things that really happened, I believe, in 1862, besides the Civil War, that changed the U.S. And had a big impact on trade and other things going forward. One of them, of course, was the Homestead Act, which President Lincoln signed into law in 1862, and that was to provide 160 acres of western land to anyone who sold the land and improved it after 5 years, and then they were able to claim it. The second was the Land Grant Act. Any of you go to a land grant university? The land grant university system, of course, was created by law in 1862 by Justin Morrill, who wrote the law. Wasn't his idea, actually. There's all these things. Sometimes it's somebody being in the right place at the right time. The idea had been floated around for several years before that. Even George Washington wanted to create sort of a public university system based on like we have for the military colleges, but that didn't go anywhere either. So the Land Grant Act basically became something, and that was to create a public university system that could be used for agriculture sciences and other mechanical sciences, and of course military sciences as well. When I went to UVM, you had to take ROTC for 2 years, or band. A lot of people who took band even though they couldn't play an instrument. But anyhow, the Land Grant Act actually, and that was based, and the third was the Pacific Railroad Act, which basically was the Intercontinental Railroad that connected the railroads on the East Coast with the West Coast and opened up the West. All these acts were based upon taking Native American land well over 1/5 of the United States at the time, or more. In terms of the Land Grant Act, each state got 30,000 acres to sell of Native American land based on the number of members of Congress they had at the time, or scripts. And some of the institutions that became land grant took the money, but never long-term became land grants. They were in the beginning. Dartmouth, Yale, Brown University, and others became land grants, but took the money but didn't remain land grants. That happens, I guess, in history. And some people don't even realize today that MIT is a land grant, even today, public land grant. A lot of history went on about that. There was an attempt in 1890, even with UVM, because when UVM became a land grant in 1863, Justin Morrill, of course, was the U.S. Senator who was behind that, and there was a determination, his request actually, that Middlebury, Norwich, and UVM become one land grant. And the state legislature actually passed a law to allow that to happen. But Middlebury wasn't keen on that. At least its board wasn't keen on that. Norwich was keen on it because the guy who was the head of Norwich actually was behind the land grant concept at the time. And UVM was yes and no on it. But they decided to be the people who undertook it, because UVM was a private institution before that. And they became a land grant, but they didn't graduate anyone in the College of Agriculture from 1863 to 1890. And so the Grange, as you know, was very powerful back in the late 1800s, nationally within Vermont. And they marched several thousand of people onto Montpelier to take the land grant away from UVM. And it passed in the House, failed in the Senate, and UVM promised to clean up their act after that. And they did, but it didn't happen really until the Extensions Act was passed in 1940, when they really connected with the farm population in Vermont and became viable after that. Other things that, of course, happened that changed things was the further development of the West with cheap water and irrigation. If you haven't read a book, there's a wonderful book on that called Cadillac Desert that talks about the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation developing dams across the country, many of which probably shouldn't have been developed. Years ago, one of my life experiences, I guess, was I was out in Nevada at a function, and the guy was in charge of agriculture there. I said, "What do you grow here?" He said, "Oh, we grow a lot of alfalfa." I said, "You do?" "Yeah, 3 or 4 crops a year." I said, "How the heck do you do that?" He said, "You see those mountains up there? Know that snow mountain we have up there? All that water that goes into the Colorado River down here and all that? We take a lot of that, and we irrigate the crops." I said, "Well, what do you do with the crops?" He said, "We send it to those large dairies out in California." Yeah, alfalfa. I said, "That must be pretty expensive." So you have a lot of that taking place, which is sort of coming home to roost in some sense as we look to the things happening going forward. Well, other things happen too. Refrigeration, of course, changed things. The ability to ship products cheaply across the country with refrigeration took place. And mechanization after World War I on the farm. And the two-family workforce after the Second World War. Some of you remember bottled milk being delivered to your home at one time. which, disappeared after the big grocery stores came in and packages changed. People wanted more convenience by going to these larger stores and not having the product delivered in the home. And then, of course, the New Deal after 1929. Some of the things that happened then, of course, were the proposal to create a Green Mountain Parkway in 1933, like the Blue Ridge Parkway. There was an attempt to basically create a parkway all the way up through pretty much the Lake Champlain side of Vermont, and it was split. The legislature passed it and endorsed it, but they decided to put it to a referendum in Vermont. Of course, we had no laws binding a referendum in our state of Vermont. It doesn't have to be accepted like in other states. But they put it out to a referendum, and it failed by about 10,000 votes, so they never built the parkway. There was an attempt, actually, to say that a parkway would really increase the flow of tourism to the state, because there's some recognition, even way back in 1893, that tourism was going to be one of the salvations to Vermont's economy. We had a Board of Agriculture that was started in 1872. In 1893, they decided to put out a brochure on the sale of hilltop farms in Vermont. And they advertised across the country, because we had been losing hilltop farms for several years in Vermont. And tourism was seen as a solution. And we had the first publicity office of any state in 1911 as a result of that attempt to increase tourism in the state of Vermont. So the parkway was seen by some as that solution to bring more tourism into the state. And then, of course, we had the Civilian Conservation Corps. We had a guy named Perry Merle, who was a state forester, who was very much involved in helping to develop the ski industry in Vermont, and parks as well. Stowe, for example, Vermont, he helped clear the mountainside with the CCC to help entice the ski industry coming to Vermont. And then in early 1930s, the Federal Resettlement Administration that existed coming out of the Roosevelt administration wanted to take over some of the hilltop farms in Vermont at the time, about 13,000 farms and over 1.5 million acres of land. And they wanted to make it a federal park system. And George Aiken was the lieutenant governor, and he headed the commission. Of course, his farm was within the area that might have been taken. And he came out against it, and it failed, even though there was a lot of debate around the system. And of course, the difference that came, some of you were probably around when the interstate was built in Vermont, back in the late 50s and early 60s. I remember going on the old roads and then on the interstate when it was just being developed. Even when I went to UVM, you could go on part of the road being developed back then. And the difference that existed with the interstate, and because when the parkway came, there was opposition, but with the interstate, there wasn't a great deal of opposition. Some, but not what, because it was different. We had the Cold War, and there was concern about nuclearization, nuclear bombs, and getting people out of the cities quickly, and you needed a road system to do it. So there wasn't that kind of opposition that you had back in 33 with the interstate, of course. So one of the other significant changes that existed that really, I believe, impacted agriculture at the time was going from milk cans to the boat cans, boat tanks. Any of you grew up on a little dairy farm or something like that? In my youth, there was milk cans. The milk truck driver would come and he'd take the milk can out of the water cooler and put it on the truck. Big milk can filled with milk. And in the late 50s and early 60s, there was a requirement that farmers had to go to bulk tanks. And it didn't come from the state, it came from the handlers that wanted it to be done. And the economics at the time, UVM and others did some studies, and they said for a farmer to do it economically, you had to have more than 30 cows, 30 dairy cows. And the studies in Vermont said that at the time that 60% of the farms in Vermont had less than 18 cows, and 80% of them had less than 28 cows. So the majority of farms didn't have the required number. And by 1963, 1/3 of them were out of business, and by 1970, 2/3 were out of business. Some more than that for obvious reasons, but it really changed the whole rural landscape in Vermont very quickly by requiring that change. Well, what's happening today, there's a great deal of what I call consolidation that continues to take place in agriculture. In my lifetime, I remember back in the Nixon administration, I wasn't part of it, but that Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz at the time said you had to get big or get out. And that was because the Soviet Union came in and bought a lot of grain from the US, and he was behind saying you better get big or get out because you need to meet those markets. And that's happening today, and a great deal. If you look at the changes taking place, and today, see, in 1900 we had 33,000 farms, 86% were dairy. Today we have on dairy less than 500 dairy farms left in the state. And 60% of the retail food sales today are controlled by 5 companies. Walmart, which is about 20%, Costco, Kroger, and Albertsons. 2 of those want to merge, of course. Kroger's and Albertsons want to merge into one big company. 4 companies control 85% of the meat packing and processing in the country. 4 poultry companies control 54% of that industry. 4 pork companies control 70% of the production in the country. In dairy, 3 cooperatives control 83% of the milk sales. Dairy Farmers of America, California Dairies, and Land O'Lakes. We don't have any dairy cooperative headquartered in Vermont anymore. Cabot is not headquartered. Agrimark is not headquartered in Vermont anymore. Today, 68% of U.S. milk production is provided by about 8% of dairy farms, and is projected to be 5% in a few years. So a great deal of consolidation taking place in the country. And of course, 6 firms control a majority of the U.S. crop seed and ag chemical industry today, as opposed to in the past. But we do have a lot going on in terms of specialty food in the country. By the way, did any of you see that Ben & Jerry's, Unilever wants to sell Ben & Jerry's? I remember when Ben & Jerry's was created by Ben & Jerry with a small gas station downtown Warrington. Any of you ever go there? Yeah, me too. I once said to the Dean of Agriculture, UVM, Bob Sinclair, who was one of my teachers, I said, Bob, how come you can't make ice cream like Ben & Jerry's? And he said, we gave them the formula. Well, they did, actually. They did. We had, ice cream being made at UVM back when I was there. And I said, somebody a few years later, I met 2 women who worked
helping to make the mix, and I said, what did you do at UVM? And they said, no, we made the ice cream mix for Ben and Jerry's. And I said, what did they pay you? They said, well, we can't tell you that. I said, I'm not gonna tell anyone. Well, today I can. They gave us a case of beer a week. That has changed, of course, in many ways. But we have a lot of things going on that are positive. Award-winning cheeses, as you see. We won a lot of awards internationally for our cheeses. Wines, breweries, and trails, you know. We had more distilleries before 1850 than we had towns. Coming back, we have a lot of distilleries and breweries and those things winning in awards. We have, you know, ciders and ice ciders, and hard ciders, and farmers markets, winter and summer, and county ag fairs, and CSAs, and food hubs, and ag tourism. The state says that in 2014, 35% of the tourists visited farms or farmers markets, and 39% participated in food or drink experience. That's pretty good. Ben and Jerry's ice cream in Waterbury is one of the big tourist attractions, apparently. And Billings Farm in Woodstock, Shelburne's Farms in Shelburne. We have a lot of interesting attraction going on. Farm stay program. Yeah, Vermont's not a major farm production state anymore. I would agree with that, but we are known for our food systems today, which is positive. A lot have been done. Farm to plate, working landscape, Vermont House and Conservation Board, Vermont Land Trust, current use taxation, Dairy Enterprise Center, food hubs. In early 2000, National Geographic said that Vermont was the fifth best place to visit in the world and the first best place to visit in the United States. And it said, yep, and it said that because we had quaint villages, beautiful landscape, and a plan for the future. And I said, well, I agree with the first two. Not sure about the third. But it was a great designation. Two former friends once said these things. Well, they're still friends, but I haven't seen them. One said that if agriculture were to wither away to memory, Vermont would cease to be anything unique. It would become just a distant suburb of Boston, its character defined by tourist restaurants and shopping malls. Not only does living agriculture contribute so much to the character of Vermont, but it is also indispensable to preserving the landscape, which in our time has become a vital component of the state's economic conditions or attractions. Others have made similar conclusions, saying, defined by its iconic rural countryside of farms, forests, villages, and small cities, Vermont's working landscape has emerged as key to the brand and quality of life of the state and its future. In many ways, the land shapes Vermont's culture and identity. Perhaps this is at the root of Vermont's perceived authenticity and attractiveness to visitors from around the world. So that's where we are today. So thank you. Any questions?
The study you mentioned about needing 30 cows to justify the bulk, did you say that was a UVM study?
That was a UVM Extension Service study that looked at that. And they were pretty specific that was, in the town I grew up on Brookline, we had probably about 12 people that shipped milk at the time. Very small operation, many of them 6 to 8 cows, but they shipped it. And after that, we only had 3 actually did it for a while. It's very expensive to make that economic investment. And many did, many had other jobs that they were doing, so dairy was sort incidental to their operation. You know, the other thing that was kind of interesting, if you look at how immigration was so important to Vermont agriculture, in 1890, we had a governor in the state, 1890s, Governor Dillingham, and he was very concerned, as was the legislature, about the loss of hilltop farms in Vermont. So he decided that he would create a commission to investigate how to change that. And he appointed a senator from Bennington County to head up the commission. And he was intent of making sure that the people who were brought in were not Catholic, Irish, or anything but white and his view appropriate, of course, which looking back was terrible. But so he sent a group to Sweden to bring over several Swedish families to take over some of these hilltop farms, many of them in Windham County. And they became wonderful citizens, of course, but that didn't rectify the loss of hilltop farms. But can you think of that kind of thing taking place?
Yeah.
Really? Yeah. I mean, you had French Canadians coming down, taking over farms in Northeast Kingdom. I did a project when I was in college, after I graduated, for one summer before I did my Army obligation, for a few weeks. And I went around surveying farmers in northern Vermont, many times in the evening, sitting down at the kitchen table. And many times, some of them couldn't speak English. They had a family member who would translate for them. But it was wonderful to see that change taking place. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned that in the 18th century, early 18th century, a lot of our farms, most of them were subsistence farms. And then the number that you gave for today's definition of farming was those that sell over, was it over 1,000?
By census, that's a census
By
definition,
census.
over
Yeah,
1,000, yeah.
When we think of maintaining and recovering rural character in Vermont, what do you think is the role of subsistence farming and home farming versus farming as business?
Well, I think, people who engage, I love to go to farmers markets. When I travel, I go to see my kids in Wisconsin, or I go to different places. I always go to a farmer's market because you get to see what's happening there, and different products. I think it's wonderful that people do all kinds of things, whether it's full-time or part-time or whatever. It's wonderful to see the products being produced. And most people, even when I worked for Farm Credit Banks years ago, you look at the statistics, and some member had to work off the farm for benefits, even back then, for health insurance or something, for extra income. So, it's interesting to see the transition taking place. One of the things that really, I think, helped keep Vermont in the image of doing new products was the Back to the Land movement in the 60s, when you had a lot of people coming in and really thinking about new things and doing new things that created some energy around products and how to use the land and new things. So there's a lot of that energy taking place. We could never really long-term be competitive in the dairy industry because of the scale of operations today. Some of them in the Midwest, 20 to 30,000 cows in one farm. 20 to 30,000 cows in one farm. And they've got economies of scale. And we don't have the land mass here to do that kind of operation. I've got a family farm that I know down in well, down in Vermont, the Miller's farm, over 100 years old. And two boys, they're not boys, two men, came back, and they both, have advanced degrees, came back to take over the farm. And I said to one of them, I said, how come you went organic? He said, well, it's very easy, Roger. He said, I have a hobby of flying planes. And he said, I was flying to a air show somewhere. I was flying over Indiana, and I looked down and I saw this huge farm. I saw all the hutches, and I saw them, how they were located near the interstate. And I said, we'll never be able to compete with that scale of operation. He said, so we decided to, be organic, to be more small scale. Now they're doing bottling of milk. They're selling milk commercially in the stores and other things. So, they're not being trapped by huge kind of operation. But our industry is always going to be transitioning. I'm not surprised that Ben & Jerry's is being sold at all. A few years ago, I said to they called and wanted to talk about the future. Not that I'm great at that. I said, how come you're not organic? They said, well, we want to source most of our milk from Vermont in the future. And I said, well, that's good. That's encouraging. I said, how come you're not organic? They said, well, most buyers think we are. I said, well, that's interesting. Well, tell me more. He said, yeah, most buyers think we are, but if we went organic, we'd have to blow more air into the ice cream. I said, well, that's interesting, to have the same price points. And I said, well, it seemed to me that you're not really interested in anything.
Do you think it's prohibitive for organic farms as opposed to other farms to survive here?
Is it?
Is it harder for organic
Well,
farms?
I would say what's happened to the organic market is to some extent the same thing that's happened to the conventional market. Because in the past, USDA didn't really, we were the first state that created the organic standards, actually. And then Pat Leahy nationally created the organic standards, but they weren't really being adhered to in terms of what needed to be done by USDA. So you had a lot of large farms that claimed to be organic that didn't adhere to the standards. So what's happened to the organic price in the dairy industry is the same thing that's happened to the conventional price. So that's why you've seen people like the Millers and others try to do other things, because they're not relying on just the organic market to provide subsistence to them going forward. Same things happen.
Don't hold me to the numbers, but I understand there's a pretty major milking operation in Chester.
What?
A dairy in Chester, we've like milking 800 head. That seems surprising, given all that you said.
Well, they're not the only one. There's, Bridport, Vermont, the Audettes are milking several hundred. There's majority-wise, most of the milk is coming out on larger farms, but even on that scale, they haven't been able to exist without selling the development rights and doing other things. I know the Audettes down in Addison County are very good farmers. Do other things besides selling milk, energy and other things to survive. But we can't long term, I could go into great history of dairy pricing and how it's outdated. The price of dairy on the commodity side, the pricing system was developed in 1937.
Right.
1937. So we're still operating on it. 1937.
Yeah, I was just curious, because a couple of years ago, Horizon canceled like 81 contracts.
Yeah.
And,
Yep.
and I think it forced a number out
Yep.
of business.
Yep.
But I wonder what opportunity there might be for this group of farmers to buy Ben & Jerry's.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, that's a good question. I could tell you quite a few stories about that. When Ben & Jerry, just before I left Montpelier, that job, we had a function
in Waterbury at the Ben and Jerry's plant with dairy farmers and others. The price was really very soft then. And Ben and Jerry's came. In fact, I have a picture of them hugging me for some reason. I don't know why. I'm not huggable. But anyhow, they said, we're going to correct this price system. We promise you. We're going to correct this price system. Well, they didn't own Ben and Jerry's and they sold it off for a lot of money. Nothing ever happened, of course, from that. But they said, we're going to, but the, you know, when DFA, Dairy Farmers of America, St. Albans Co-op, of course, went out of business. Well, they sold the DFA. They had to, because co-ops, of course, only operate if they have good capital. And they have a lot of capital. A lot of that capital comes from farmer members themselves. And they, you know, unless you have a certain size, you don't really have the ability to sustain that kind of capital. And so St. Albans went out of business, or they sold to DFA. And I got a call one day, this was after I was out of Montpelier for a long period of time. I got a call from one day from two of the large dairy farmers up there. And they said, can we sit down with you? I said, well, yeah, I'd love to talk to you. I have no impact on anything, but willing to talk to you about what you want to do. So I met them in Randolph, of all places, McDonald's, one morning for coffee. And they said, you know, we didn't have any choice. We were on the board of the co-op there. We didn't have a choice because we didn't have any capital left to do what we needed to do. But we don't think we can survive long-term under the Dairy Farmers of America because the pricing system that will exist long-term, you know, on scale operations like that. We'd like to do something. And I said, well, that's interesting. You know, you ought to talk to maybe the ag secretary at the time about it. And maybe there's options. You can buy a plant, and there's some plants then for sale. But I said, it's going to take a lot of capital. Because we know it, but we have, some people can maybe analyze the numbers and do it. Yeah, you know, St. Albans at one time had a chance to buy Ben and Jerry's early on.
I'm just curious, because if you look at Ben and Jerry's and, you know, versus Stonyfield,
Yeah,
you know, Stonyfield's been a very successful company.
yeah, but they, you know, they were bought out.
Yeah, they were,
And
I think it's
they were bought out.
Nestle.
No, no, the large French firm, the large French yogurt company bought them out. Same one.
That's right.
Yeah, and we know not doing on the other one. Yeah, yeah, and in fact, we went over to talk to Hirschberg when they were bought out about a week later. Steve Taylor, who was the ag secretary or ag commissioner in New York, and a couple of us went over there and sat down with Gary at his table and said, gee, Gary, tell us about the sale. And he said, well, he said, we got a lot of money. I said, well, yeah, that's good for you. How about the industry going forward? And he said, well, he said, you know, they paid too much for us. I said, well, didn't hurt you. We got too much. And he said, I think what's going to happen in the future is that they're going to have to reduce the price to farmers on what they have because they pay too much. And said the other thing that happens in the organic market is that he said there's a price break beyond which consumers are willing to pay an organic price. So it gets soft at a certain point because a lot of people can't afford that organic price, even though it's what should be done. He said, so I see some softening of the market long term in that regard. In the millers and down in Vernon, still sell to Stonyfield. But they said to me a few years ago, they said, you know, we're not going to be captured by our market. He said, we sell a certain percent to Stonyfield, but we understand that long term they could get their milk cheaper from a large operation than trucking it from a few small operations around the countryside. So we're going to always try to build our business the way it ought to be built for our business, not relying on an external source. So yeah,
if you look at what's happening in a lot of these places, controlled by a large internet, Unilever, if you look at Unilever, I remember, God, I have too many past lives, but at one time I was on a trade advisory committee to USDA and the ag and trade investor. And the guy who advised us said to me one day, he said, Roger, you need to understand this international trade stuff. I said, yeah, tell me about it. He said, these large multinational companies, they really don't care long-term where they get the product as long as they get it the cheapest. That's what they're about. Because they speak to a board of directors. And Unilever, that's what drives them is the bottom line. And, now they're sourcing most of their cream not from Vermont, but from out of state. Anyhow, change takes place.
Well, thank you very much, Roger. That was wonderful.